Hey guys, tonight we begin with the long-forgotten world of ancient Mesopotamia, with the real unsung figures of temple life. The women who were labelled sacred. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Let's begin where all questionable destinies start, with your parents, whose love is so boundless they just gave you to a fertility cult. It's 2300 BCE, you're 10. Your biggest concern used to be whether your clay doll had enough beads. Now your mother's buttering you up with phrases like, Inanna has chosen you, which sounds suspiciously like, you've been volunteered for something you didn't sign up for. And no, there's no opt-out form. Just a long stare from your dad and a suspicious lack of eye contact. Because in Mesopotamia, if your family couldn't afford a proper dowry, or you had the audacity to be born after your older sister, you were gently escorted into divine service. Like a subscription, except you don't get a trial period, and the cancellation policy is death by blasphemy. The Temple of Inanna accepts all major sacrifices: livestock, grain, and unwanted daughters. Once you're in, you're renamed, redressed, and repurposed. Like upcycling, but emotionally scarring. Your initiation includes fasting, chanting, and probably bathing in sacred river water that hasn't been filtered since the Euphrates got bored. You'll be handed a ceremonial linen wrap, told it's a blessing, and then assigned to sleep in a room that smells like burnt frankincense and other people's regrets. Your parents go home proud. They think they just secured themselves divine favour. Meanwhile, you're trying to figure out if you're allowed to cry during blessed silence hours. Spoiler, you're not. The temple priests are cheerful in that cult leader sort of way. Hollow eyes, tight smiles, and an unsettling obsession with ritual nudity. They welcome you with phrases like, your body is the goddess's temple, which you will come to understand is ancient code for say goodbye to personal boundaries. And let's not forget your new title, Pr0stitute, a sacred devotee of the goddess. Sounds elegant, right? Until you realize it means you now represent divine femininity via awkward public acts of fertility while the elders take notes. You haven't even hit puberty yet, and somehow you're already spiritually married to a goddess who likes blood, wine, and drama. Welcome to sacred womanhood, where every honor feels like a trap, and the mat you sleep on is probably older than your grandfather's beard. And this is only the first day. When someone says the word temple, you probably imagine serene incense, calming chants, and maybe a wise priest humming softly while a bowl of fruit glows in the sunlight. Yeah. No. The Temple of Inanna was less wellness retreat and more chaotic theocratic HR office, with added sex magic and livestock. You step inside expecting divine peace, and are instead greeted by a goat relieving itself near a ceremonial statue. The walls are covered in cuneiform that nobody has translated for 400 years. The floors are sticky with spilled beer offerings, and the only scent in the air is burnt goat with top notes of desperation. As a new recruit, you assumed you'd be trained by elegant high priestesses in flowing robes. Instead, you get barked at by a wrinkled woman named Ninlil, who smells like garlic and disappointment. She hands you a broom and says, the goddess loves a clean floor, which is Mesopotamian for your sacred training begins with janitorial duties. The rooms are a maze, not in a holy labyrinth kind of way, but in a, we've added 12 extensions to this building since 2000 BCE and no one drew a floor plan kind of way. One hall leads to the sacred archive, another to the ritual performance space, and one definitely just ends at a pit. You are told not to ask about the pit. There are no plush cushions, no massages, no fountains gurgling with rosewater. The only flowing water is from the sacrificial basin, which hasn't been properly scrubbed since the reign of Sargon the Great. You're assigned a mat on the floor next to 3 other girls. Privacy is a myth here, along with fair compensation and boundaries. Meals consist of lentils, flatbread, and the constant reminder that you're doing this for Inanna, even if you're really just doing it because your parents needed a tax write-off. When night falls, you lie awake listening to the sounds of distant drums, drunken chants, and what you hope is a sheep and not a priest rehearsing the fertility rites alone. This temple doesn't restore your spirit. It grinds it into clay, stamps it with a god's name, and files it under assets. But don't worry, the spa day is coming. It's just probably going to involve you being the exfoliated item. You are promised a sacred role, a divine calling, a spiritual vocation of the highest order. What you were not promised? A schedule that starts before sunrise, ends after moonrise, includes 0 bathroom breaks, and features you pretending to be a living symbol of divine fertility, while old men chant around you and spill date wine on your sandals. Let's be clear. The temple did not hand you a pamphlet. No scroll, no orientation video, no friendly priestess with a clipboard explaining workplace boundaries. You learned your duties the old-fashioned way, through vague metaphors and passive-aggressive hymns. At first, they tell you that your body is a vessel of the goddess. Sounds nice, right? Until you realize that being a divine vessel is less chalice of wisdom and more community-use goblet with questionable cleaning protocols. Your training includes walking in perfect circles, chanting while balancing a jug on your head, and practicing sacred gestures that make you look like you're attempting to signal passing boats. None of this is explained. You're just told to move like Inanna, which is profoundly unhelpful when no one actually agrees on how Inanna moved. Then there's the ceremonial dancing. You are not a trained dancer. You are a teenager with chronic foot blisters and the rhythm of a startled donkey. But the priests nod solemnly and call it beautiful, which is Mesopotamian for good enough for the goddess, and also the drunk merchant watching. And now, the elephant in the ziggurat, the sacred sexual rites. No one told you what they actually involved. You thought it was metaphorical, a symbolic honouring of fertility, a poetic reenactment of myths. But no, it turns out you're the starring role in a live-action fertility drama with actual men from the community who have paid actual barley. Barley. Not silver. Not gold. Barley. Your first reaction is, surely this is optional. It is not. The gods, apparently, are very pro-barley-based economics. If you try to protest, you're told you don't understand the divine will. If you ask questions, you get reassigned to cleaning the sacred goat stalls, which are not metaphorical. You slowly realize this whole sacred role is just a job nobody wanted to write down. Probably because if anyone did write it down, future historians might get suspicious. If you thought your temple duties couldn't get more uncomfortable after barley-based mating interviews, buckle up. It's time for the rituals. Now, in theory, these ceremonies are meant to reconnect humanity with the divine. In practice, they're elaborate public performances where your main job is to look mysterious while swaying to rhythms that sound suspiciously like someone banging pots in the next room. Let's start with the outfits. Each ritual has its own specific wardrobe, all of which fall under the category designed by someone who has never worn clothes. There's the feathered diadem of Inanna, which itches like a curse, the sheer veil that offers zero warmth or modesty, and the ceremonial belt that's really just a rope with delusions of grandeur. You're told to wear these with grace while balancing a platter of sacred dates and pretending your feet aren't screaming. Meanwhile, a priest wearing 20 pounds of beads and an expression of cosmic constipation reads poetry to the goddess. It's all very moving, especially when you realize the poem is just a veiled complaint about grain taxes. During the fertility rite of spring, things get particularly dicey. The temple floor is covered in flower petals, which sounds poetic until you slip on a damp one and nearly reintroduce gravity to your jawline. You're meant to perform a slow, sensual circle around a sacred plinth while humming a tune that's never been written down and never will be, because it's improvised, and you're not a bard, you're a barley-salaried body double. You've also been trained in symbolic movements, like the gesture of the blooming womb, which looks suspiciously like a shrug, a bow, and a cramp at the same time. The audience is a mix of worshippers, drunks, and a handful of scribes taking notes way too enthusiastically. Then comes the offering segment. You kneel, hold up your bowl of lentils, and chant the divine words. Except one time, you sneeze mid-offering and accidentally bless the wrong god. For a week, everything smells like fish, and the high priest glares at you like you personally insulted the ziggurat's plumbing. But remember, it's all sacred. Every humiliating misstep, every mispronounced chant, every goat that wanders into the ritual space mid-procession, it's all part of the divine mystery. Especially the goat. He's a regular. Let's set the scene. The temple is hot. Not tropical beach hot, more like bake a date pastry on your own thigh. Hot. Add in 50 people, 3 goats, burning incense, and a sacrificial fire pit that nobody remembers to ventilate. And you have a scent profile best described as eau de ancien armpit. As a temple prostitute, your official title might be Nadatu, Kadishtu, or another name that sounds impressive in Sumerian. But your hygiene routine? Roughly equivalent to that of a damp pot left under a ziggurat. Bathing is technically part of your sacred duties. In practice, though, it involves a cracked ceramic basin, half a jug of lukewarm river water, and a scrub sponge that might also double as a ritual object. No one's sure. Soap exists, sort of, but it's made from ash and lard and smells like something you'd offer a demon to make it go away. The elite priestesses, of course, get real baths, courtyards with drainage systems, fresh oils, rose petals. They get perfumed towels and assistants with soft hands. You? You get a broken clay jar and a judgmental goose watching the whole process from a corner. Hair care? There's oil, but it's shared among 12 women and a scribe who insists it prevents baldness. You comb your hair with a stick, twist it into something vaguely ceremonial, and hope the gods don't notice the lice. Spoiler, they do. That's why there's a whole hymn about divine itching. Clothing is washed once every lunar cycle, or whenever someone spills wine on it, whichever comes first. You own 2 ceremonial tunics, one for rituals and one for pretending you're not in a constant state of existential rash. And let's not even talk about oral hygiene. The best case scenario is a rinse with beer, which sounds fun until you realise the beer is flat, warm, and more bread than liquid. There are no toothbrushes, just twigs. And prayers. Lots of prayers. The worst part? Every time a merchant shows up with crushed myrrh, the high priest buys it for sacred anointing. And somehow you're never the one getting anointed. You're just the one handing out towels. Let's talk about clients. Not worshippers, not pilgrims, not noble devotees moved by the divine mysteries of Inanna. No, these are regular mortal men. Sometimes very mortal, often very regular. Your first time waiting for a ritual partner, you imagined a well-oiled soldier poet, someone tragic and handsome, someone who'd quote hymns and weep softly under the stars, someone who, perhaps, smelled like cedar and danger. What you got was a sweaty grain merchant named Nabu with a limp and a nervous rash. He brought you 3 handfuls of barley and a half-eaten fig as tribute. You tried not to cry, mostly because that would be considered a bad omen, and you did not want to trigger another cleansing ritual. The men who show up at the temple aren't heroes. They're not even side characters. They're townsfolk with untrimmed fingernails and opinions about ox carts. They talk too much. They breathe loudly. And they all believe they are somehow blessed to be part of your divine service, even though they smell like fermented onions and haven't washed their tunics since the last lunar eclipse. You learn quickly how to spot the bad ones. The ones who ask too many questions, or not enough. The ones who believe they're gods now too, because they paid the fee. The ones who bring friends and ask if there's a group rate. There isn't. But you suspect the priests are considering it. Worst of all, the romantics. The ones who mistake your forced smile for affection, who leave you tokens, a cracked bead, a poem carved into a stick, a lock of their hair, unrequested. These men want love. You want out. Some are kind, some are awkward, some are just deeply confused about where the exit is, but none of them are Odysseus. Not even close. And yet, each encounter is billed as sacred. You're told to bless them afterward, sometimes while holding back laughter, sometimes while holding back bile, but hey, at least they usually bring barley. Usually. If you thought your job had no room for micromanagement, think again. Welcome to the temple, where the high priest has all the charisma of a tax auditor and the subtlety of a donkey in heat. And yes, he's watching you. Always. Now, theoretically, he's here to oversee ritual purity. In practice, he's perched behind a beaded curtain like some Mesopotamian version of a reality show host crossed with a suspicious uncle. His eyes never blink. His sandals squeak ominously. And every time you try to relax, he clears his throat like it's an ancient curse. He's the one who assigned you this sacred duty. He's also the one who decides whether you performed your rite with proper reverence. A vague phrase that seems to mean whatever he wants it to mean that week. One day, it's about posture. The next, he's critiquing your tone. The day after that, it's because your left hand looked ungrateful. He takes notes during rituals, not on a tablet, on a scroll. A scroll, which means he has to lick the tip of his reed pen every time he writes. And yes, you can hear it. Every single time. Sometimes he offers feedback, unsolicited of course. You should smile more during the offerings of the sacred oil. Try humming lower during the hymn of fruitfulness. Stop flinching when the goat approaches, as if you haven't spent the past week dodging that same goat's horns. And just when you think he's left the temple for the day, there he is, behind a pillar, casually munching on pomegranate seeds like this is peak entertainment. Is it surveillance? Is it ritual obligation? Or is he just really, really nosy? Either way, you learn to work with the constant presence of priestly judgment. You smile your tightest smile, you recite your lines perfectly, and you never, ever sneeze during the incense lighting. Not unless you want a lecture on the sanctity of nasal discipline. At the end of the day you wonder, who watches the watcher? Answer, the goat. And honestly, the goat's less judgy. You'd think that, as a temple prostitute, a sacred servant of Inanna, you'd get a little divine protection from mortal drama. Alas, you're not just a living symbol of love and fertility. You're also a convenient scapegoat for every wife in the city who suspects her husband is up to something fishy. And guess what? He is. And that fishy thing is you. It starts subtly, glares from across the ziggurat steps, whispers when you walk past the barley stalls, the occasional accidental bump with a water jug. These women don't care that you're not technically allowed to marry, or that your clients are chosen by the priesthood. All they know is that their husbands keep coming home with that post-temple glow and a little too much incense in their beards. Soon enough, they form a club. Unofficial, of course, but terrifyingly organised. The Jealous Wives Club meets by the communal ovens and specialises in long stares, passive-aggressive gossip, and the strategic misplacement of your ceremonial sandals. Some will curse you under their breath. Others get creative. One carved a tiny figurine of you with a cracked foot and buried it under a dung heap. Another sent her daughter to learn the sacred rites just so she could spy on your laundry. You try not to take it personally. After all, you're just doing your job. It's not your fault the gods insist on a system that involves sensual ritual cleansing and barley offerings in dim lighting. But try explaining that to a woman who hasn't been looked at fondly since the last solstice. You once tried to befriend one of them, offered her a sweet date and a kind word. She bit into the date, looked you dead in the eye and said, "Tastes like my husband's breath." You now avoid eye contact for safety reasons. The irony? Most of the temple wives used to be in your shoes. Literally. Many were former sacred workers themselves, back when their knees didn't creak and their husbands still brought wine instead of excuses. They know the life, and maybe that's why they resent you so much. After all, they remember exactly how miserable it was, let's talk about money, or rather the stunning absence of it. Being a temple prostitute, holy servant of the divine union, sounds like the kind of job that should come with perks. At the very least, a steady stream of silver shekels and a corner seat at the festival of new grain. But alas, while the priesthood rakes in tribute after tribute, you are paid in vibes. Well, technically, you're paid in barley, dates, and the occasional goat. But don't get excited. These are symbolic offerings, and they don't go to you. They go to the temple treasury, which is managed by a priest whose idea of wealth redistribution is occasionally letting you lick the honey bowl after he's done with it. You do get meals, thin lentil stew and hard bread, and a mat to sleep on. If you're lucky, someone tosses you a linen scrap that used to be part of a nobleman's tunic, now repurposed as your ritual wrap. Fashion forward? No. Technically alive? Barely. You once dared to ask about actual wages. The high priest gave a long, winding speech about divine compensation and how Inanna blesses you in ways no coin ever could. Then he walked away, jingling a pouch of silver that definitely wasn't metaphorical. Some temple sisters try to save up by moonlighting, weaving, brewing, reading omens in goat livers for bored merchants. But if the priests find out, you get demoted to candle wicker scraper, which is exactly what it sounds like, and smells even worse. So you keep performing your sacred tasks with a plastered-on smile and a stomach that's made peace with occasional fasting. And when your sandal breaks, you just wrap it in twine and hope the goddess appreciates rustic humility. Some girls fantasize about escaping the temple and marrying rich, but let's face it, any man wealthy enough to support you probably already visited the temple, and if he didn't marry you before seeing you chant naked under moonlight, he's probably not planning to afterward. But don't worry. The gods see your sacrifice. They just don't reimburse it. If there's one thing that sums up the contradiction of your sacred career, it's this. You're not allowed to marry. That's right. You can anoint a merchant with sacred oils under a full moon. You can whisper hymns into the ear of a traveling soldier while he still smells like camel. But you may not, under any circumstances, develop an exclusive emotional connection or, heavens forbid, put on a wedding veil. This isn't just a temple rule, it's divine policy. According to the scribes and priests who definitely don't have a personal stake in this arrangement, your body belongs to the goddess. Inanna, they say, has loaned you to the mortal world for rituals of fertility and spiritual communion. You are a living altar, and altars, as we all know, do not get married and raise goats in the suburbs, which is ironic, considering you perform enough marriage rites that you could officiate a dozen weddings by now. But when it comes to actually building a life with someone, no thanks. That might involve happiness, and we can't have that. Now, some girls do fall in love. Secretly, of course, usually with a guard or a junior priest, but the minute things get serious, the temple steps in with all the grace of a hammer on wet clay. Your lover is reassigned to a distant province, and you're given extra moon vigils to help you reflect on your inappropriate attachments. The punishment for breaking the celibacy clause? You don't get stoned. That would be merciful. Instead, they keep you longer. They extend your sacred service. You get to be a senior guide to the younger temple women, which is just a fancy way of saying you supervise the incense closet and pretend not to hear them cry. So no marriage, no partnership, no cozy domestic future with a fig tree and 3 half-naked toddlers chasing chickens. Just the warm, eternal embrace of ritual duty and a goat who keeps chewing your robe. But hey, at least you're spiritually fulfilled, right? When you first arrived at the temple, fresh-faced, nervous, and still smelling vaguely of sheep, you may have harbored the faint, foolish hope that you had some say in what happened to your body. That hope was promptly incinerated in the sacred fire. As a temple prostitute, your body is no longer yours. It belongs to the temple, or to the goddess, or to the priests, or to the men offering goats, grain, or suspiciously damp silver coins. The exact chain of ownership is a bit murky, but one thing is crystal clear. You are not at the top of it. The priests refer to you as a vessel, which sounds poetic until you realize they mean it quite literally. A container, preferably empty, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. It's easier that way. Less fuss when a nobleman wants to honor Inanna with you on the third day of the moon, or when a visiting official needs a ritual blessing before signing off on barley tariffs. There's a ceremony for everything, and you are the centerpiece. Did you think you'd have a say in any of it? Oh no, sweet summer initiate. Your job is to smile serenely, undress artfully, and pretend this is all a deeply spiritual moment and not an awkward appointment that's running 10 minutes behind. Sometimes, after the sacred union, you get a moment alone. You wrap yourself in linen, sit behind the incense curtain, and try to remember what it felt like to be just a girl. Not a vessel, not a symbol, not a holy receptacle. Just you. You won't remember. Not for long. Even when you're not performing rites, there are rules. Don't bathe at certain times. Don't cut your hair unless it's during the annual shearing. Don't eat certain foods. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't run. That's ungraceful. Don't laugh. That's unholy. Don't cry. That's inconvenient. It's not just your body that isn't yours. It's your time, your voice, your breath. But hey, the temple scribes did write a hymn in your honor once. It rhymed. Sort of. Let's talk festivals. You'd think they'd be a break. A celebration, maybe even a chance to wear something clean and slightly less itchy. Nope. Welcome to the Mesopotamian equivalent of a corporate holiday party, if that party involved a lot more nudity, dancing, and emotionally repressed priests chanting about barley fertility. Festival season, which, let's be honest, happens every 6 days, is when the temple really ramps things up. You, the sacred servant, are now the star of an elaborate public performance that somehow combines theatre, religion, bad choreography, and a lot of confused livestock. On the festival of Inanna's descent, for example, you're expected to reenact the goddess's mythical journey to the underworld, symbolically, which means stripping off 7 layers of clothing in public as you descend 7 temple steps. It's ancient spiritual metaphor, and also just ancient striptease. People cheer. Children are present. There's a guy selling date beer and roasted locusts like it's the Mesopotamian Super Bowl. But the real highlight is the sacred marriage rite. This is when a high-ranking priest, or, occasionally, the king himself, symbolically mates with you, representing Dumuzi and Inanna uniting to bless the crops. The ceremony takes place in front of everyone. There's music, incense, a lot of awkward eye contact. You are supposed to moan spiritually. Afterward, everyone feasts. You, however, go back to your mat smelling like burnt frankincense and questionable symbolism. Then comes the parade of the divine maidens, where you're herded through the streets in full ritual garb, i.e. sheer linen and regret, waving to onlookers while trying not to pass out in the sun. Elders toss flower petals. Teen boys toss comments. Some festivals involve ritual bathing, which is temple code for being scrubbed raw by a matron with delusions of cleanliness and a pumice stone from hell. Others involve long fasting periods before the big day, so you get to faint halfway through a fertility dance, which, ironically, makes the priest call you divinely fragile. That's not a compliment. It's a warning label. And no, you don't get the day off afterward. You get kitchen duty, because even divine vessels are expected to stir the lentils. You'd think life as a temple prostitute would at least earn you a little professional solidarity. After all, you and your fellow sacred companions are all bound by the same goddess, the same rituals, and the same uncomfortable linen wrap that never fits right after washing. But no, the real eternal flame in this temple is the gossip. It burns brightly, fueled by equal parts jealousy, judgment, and whatever wine the scribes forgot to lock up. Let's start with the eldest sister, who hasn't performed a rite in years but still struts around like she invented sacred intimacy. She'll whisper to anyone within earshot that you were chosen for last week's fertility rite, not because of your aura, but because the high priest has a thing for girls with crooked toes. Meanwhile, Kibi, the wide-eyed initiate, keeps accidentally bumping into you during morning incense prep just to ask things like, "Is it true you cried during the last spring rite? In front of the merchants from Kish? No, Kibi. It was smoke in my eyes. And yes, I hope your next divine cleansing includes extra nettles. Of course, the sacred chamber walls are very thin. You think you're having a private moment of reflection, or maybe eating that honey fig someone left as an offering, and suddenly everyone knows you snuck an extra bite. By mid-afternoon, the story will be that you seduced a merchant for his figs. By evening, the fig will have turned into a gold ring, and by moonrise, someone will be writing a hymn about it. Then there's the unofficial rankings. Who has the most devoted clients? Who got offered a silver comb? Who's been noticed by the high priest's cousin's uncle? They say comparison is the thief of joy. In the temple, it's the main event. But the real art form? Passive-aggressive blessings. May Inanna give you the stamina to keep up with all that attention. One sister smiles sweetly. May your next ritual go smoother than your last, another chimes in. Which would be touching, if she hadn't watched that ritual from behind a pillar while snickering into her prayer beads. In the temple, silence is sacred, but gossip is divine sport. In the temple, obedience isn't just expected, it's theology. You're not simply a worker with a bad job and worse linen robes. You're a divine vessel. And divine vessels don't talk back, show up late, or skip that very awkward fertility demonstration just because they were having a mild emotional breakdown. Because if you do, it's the Euphrates for you, sweetheart. The river test was Mesopotamia's favorite form of conflict resolution. Did you offend the priest? Break a sacred vase? Whisper that the god statue looks like it's judging your posture? To the river you go, to let the gods decide your guilt. Think of it as a spiritual performance review with a strong current. Here's how it works. You're escorted usually by a group of smirking elders and at least one guy with a very large stick down to the banks of the river. There you're ritually bound, because free swimming would be cheating, given a brief prayer. May the gods show mercy, or something equally vague, and tossed in like yesterday's offering. If you float or manage to swim to safety, it means the gods approve of you. You're innocent. You might even get promoted. If you sink or get eaten by a crocodile, well, guilt confirmed. Now, being a temple prostitute didn't come with many rights, but you did have the honour of being tested with extra drama. Your test might involve more elaborate blessings beforehand, which don't help, but do make your potential drowning feel festive. Occasionally they even let the clients watch, like it's some sort of divine reality show. But here's the kicker. Everyone wants to believe the gods will intervene. Even you. Until you realise that the guy tying your wrists is also the guy who accused you of lacking piety after you rolled your eyes at his chant. Spoiler, the gods rarely intervened. Those who survived the river came back soaking, half dead, and now officially untouchable, which, in temple terms, meant they could sweep the courtyard but were no longer allowed near the sacred bread. Which is probably fine. You weren't eating much anyway, so you've survived decades of incense smoke, fertility rituals, river trials, and passive-aggressive prayers. Your hips creak like badly maintained ziggurats, your back's been bowed more times than a sacrificial bull, and your youthful allure now draws more sympathy than divine favour. Surely now, at the twilight of your temple career, you get to rest. Maybe sip some pomegranate wine under the shade of a fig tree and tell scandalous stories to wide-eyed initiates. Absolutely not. Welcome to retirement, Mesopotamian style. You don't get a pension. You get promoted to weaver, herbalist, or if the gods really want to laugh, full-time celibate caretaker of the sacred goats. You're now what the scribes call a nada too, a cloistered temple woman devoted to the gods and to never experiencing joy again. As a nada too, you live in a cell, and not like a cozy monk's cell with rustic vibes. This is a room with a mat, a lamp, and the lingering smell of cumin and existential dread. You're expected to weave cloth for the temple, copy sacred hymns by hand, and generally stay out of the way unless your advice is needed, which it isn't. You don't have children. You don't have a husband. You don't even have your old lovers sending you offerings anymore. Apparently once your sacred duties expire, so does your fan base. Oh, and those younger temple girls. They now look at you like you're a living cautionary tale. Did she really serve Inanna for 40 years? Why does she mutter about fig theft in her sleep? Didn't she once bite a priest? Yes, and technically, but he deserved it. But there's one upside. You finally get a tiny taste of peace. No more awkward rituals. No more rivalries over who gets the most gold-plated amulets. And best of all, nobody expects you to smile through another fertility chant. You sit in your corner, hum ancient hymns and think, at least I'm not in the river. Because in the end, surviving is the divine reward. In ancient China, food was never just food. It was philosophy, medicine, and politics, all served on a lacquered tray. To eat was to participate in the balance of the cosmos. Every dish, whether simple millet porridge or extravagant shark fin soup, carried meaning. The guiding principle was yin and yang, opposing forces that, when balanced, kept the body healthy and the empire stable. Cold ingredients like cucumber or mung beans were thought to cool fiery temperaments, while warming foods like ginger or lamb stoked the body's inner furnace. An emperor's chef had to know not only the flavours of the kitchen, but also the theories of Chinese medicine, so that a banquet was as much a prescription as a feast, but food also screamed status. While peasants ate what was necessary, rice in the south, wheat noodles in the north, emperors and nobles flaunted rare delicacies that proved their dominion over both nature and people. Eating something exotic was a way of saying, I control the farthest mountains and seas, and I can bring them to my table. Bird's nest soup, for example, required harvesting swiftlet nests clinging to cliffs in Southeast Asia. Serving it at court was a display of wealth, patience, and sheer logistical power. The rarer the ingredient, the more divine the ruler appeared. And then there was ritual. Food wasn't only for survival or pleasure, it was for the ancestors. During festivals like Qingming, families laid out spreads of pork, fish, and rice wine before ancestral tablets, believing the spirits consumed the essence of the offerings. At the highest level, the emperor himself performed sacrifices at the Temple of Heaven, presenting whole oxen, sheep, and pigs to secure harmony between heaven and earth. To dine was to govern, to eat was to pray. So when we talk about ancient Chinese delicacies, we're not talking about snacks you grab at a street stall. We're talking about carefully engineered symbols of cosmic order, political legitimacy, and spiritual duty. In this world, a bowl of soup could mean the difference between balance and chaos, between health and sickness, even between heaven's blessing and heaven's wrath. Imagine sitting at the emperor's table in the Forbidden City. This was not dinner as you know it. This was a stage performance, a display of cosmic order, and a reminder that the Son of Heaven ate differently than everyone else on earth. A typical imperial banquet could feature more than 100 dishes, some for actual consumption, others purely for show. The idea was not that the emperor would taste everything, but that the abundance itself demonstrated power. To feed him was to feed the empire. The preparation for such a feast was a logistical marvel. The imperial kitchens employed hundreds of cooks, each with a specialized role. One for roasting meats, another for soups, another for pastries, and so on. There were even separate kitchens for different meals of the day. The staff worked under strict supervision, since feeding the emperor was as much a matter of survival as taste. One poorly cooked dish could mean dismissal, and one poisoned morsel could topple dynasties. Tasting officials were assigned to sample every plate before it reached the throne. The emperor's table was also a space for ritual. Meals began with offerings to the ancestors and to heaven itself. Certain dishes appeared only at specific times of year. Lotus root in summer for cooling, lamb in winter for warmth. Rare ingredients from distant provinces or tributary states were paraded before the court to emphasize the reach of imperial authority. A dragon's feast, so to speak, stretched from the deserts of Xinjiang to the shores of Guangdong. Then there was etiquette. To dine with the emperor required careful choreography. Officials never began eating until he lifted his chopsticks. Servants moved silently, gliding like shadows, replenishing teacups and whisking away discarded bones. Each gesture reinforced hierarchy. The emperor ate slowly, with dignity, while everyone else mirrored his pace, careful never to outshine or out-eat him. This table was also where politics happened. To be invited to share a dish was a privilege, a sign of imperial favour. A single bowl of soup could raise a man's fortune or signal his downfall. In this setting, food was not merely nourishment. It was diplomacy, medicine, ritual, and theatre rolled into one. At the emperor's table, eating was never ordinary. It was destiny, plated in porcelain. Of all the strange and treasured foods in ancient China, bird's nest soup sat at the very top of the imperial menu. It wasn't made from twigs or leaves, but from the hardened saliva of the swiftlet, a small bird that nested in caves along the coasts of Southeast Asia. To harvest these nests, workers risked their lives climbing sheer cliffs or dangling from ropes in pitch-black caverns, scraping fragile nests from the rock face. Each nest was a prize, fragile as glass and worth its weight in silver. To the Chinese court, this soup was far more than a culinary oddity. It was medicine, luxury, and divine gift combined. Doctors of traditional Chinese medicine praised it for strengthening the lungs, replenishing qi, improving digestion, and even enhancing beauty. It was believed to soothe coughs, keep skin youthful, and extend longevity. To sip from this delicate broth was to ingest not just food, but health, vitality, and prestige. No wonder emperors demanded it for banquets, and nobles hoarded it as a symbol of their superior status. The preparation itself was meticulous. Nests had to be soaked for hours to soften, then painstakingly cleaned of feathers and debris. What remained was a translucent jelly-like substance that, when simmered, produced a broth with an almost ethereal texture. Subtle, slightly sweet, but most of all, rare. Bird's nest soup wasn't meant to dazzle the tongue with bold flavours. Instead, it was prized for its purity, its aura of refinement. A dish that whispered, rather than shouted, its worth. This delicacy also carried political weight. Tributary states like those in modern-day Malaysia and Indonesia were expected to provide birds' nests as part of their offerings to the Chinese court. To present such treasures was to acknowledge the emperor's supremacy. In turn, the emperor, by serving bird's nest soup at his table, displayed the vast reach of his empire's influence. Every spoonful reinforced the idea that heaven had blessed his rule with abundance from the farthest corners of the world. Of course, the average farmer in Henan or fisherman in Fujian never even smelled bird's nest soup. This was food for emperors, concubines, and the highest mandarins. For the rest, it remained a distant legend, a dish whispered about in markets, but never tasted. So, bird's nest soup wasn't just dinner. It was a cliffside conquest, a medical prescription, a diplomatic tool, and a symbol of heaven's favour, all simmered into one porcelain bowl. When most people think of silkworms, they picture shimmering robes, not dinner plates. But in ancient China, nothing went to waste, not even the wriggling little creatures that spun silk. Once the delicate threads were harvested for weaving, the plump silkworm pupae remained behind, and the Chinese court found a way to turn them into food. To outsiders, it might sound horrifying, snacking on insects. But in China, it was practical, symbolic, and surprisingly prestigious. Silkworm pupae were considered highly nutritious. Packed with protein, fat, and essential minerals, they were seen as a concentrated source of energy. In traditional Chinese medicine, they were believed to tonify the blood, improve skin, and balance the body's inner energies. Emperors and nobles consumed them not only as a curiosity, but as a supplement, a way to fortify their strength and preserve vitality. In a culture where food was inseparable from health, silkworm pupae represented medicine wrapped in a crunchy shell. Preparation varied. Sometimes the pupae were roasted until crisp, other times boiled and seasoned with soy or spices. The texture was chewy, the flavour nutty, earthy, even slightly sweet depending on the method. It wasn't a delicacy designed to seduce with flavor alone, but with the idea that by consuming the silkworm, one absorbed the same transformative energy that turned mulberry leaves into silk. To eat a silkworm pupa was to take part in a cycle of metamorphosis, a small ritual of transformation at the table. There was also symbolism at play. Silk itself was the fabric of wealth, a material that clothed emperors, monks, and envoys from distant lands. To eat the byproduct of silk production was, in a way, to consume luxury itself. Imagine hosting a banquet where guests wore silk gowns while being served dishes made from the very creatures that produced them. It was both decadent and poetic, a reminder that even insects could be transformed into status symbols. Of course, not everyone in China was indulging in this crunchy delicacy. Silkworm pupae were expensive, tied directly to the silk industry, and thus most often appeared on the tables of the elite. For peasants, it was a story told rather than a dish tasted. But for the imperial court, silkworm pupae bridged the worlds of fashion, medicine, and cuisine in one bite. So the next time you think about silk, remember, in ancient China, the emperor might have been wearing it on his shoulders and chewing on it at supper. Few dishes in Chinese history symbolized power and extravagance quite like shark fin soup. To modern sensibilities, it may sound like a questionable culinary choice, but for centuries it was the crown jewel of imperial banquets. Served in golden bowls and reserved for the most important occasions, shark fin soup wasn't about taste alone. It was about announcing to the world that the emperor commanded the oceans themselves. The fins were prized for their texture rather than flavor. Once softened through long hours of simmering, they developed a slippery, gelatinous consistency that Chinese gourmands described as luxurious. To this, chefs added rich broths flavored with chicken, ham, or abalone, creating a dish that felt opulent in the mouth. Eating shark fin soup wasn't meant to satisfy hunger. It was a performance of refinement. To lift a porcelain spoonful was to signal wealth, sophistication, and access to the rarest treasures of the sea. Medicine, of course, played its role. Traditional Chinese doctors claimed shark fins could boost energy, improve kidney health, and enhance virility. Whether or not these effects were real, the symbolism mattered. Serving shark fin soup at a banquet was like offering bottled vitality to one's guests, a culinary blessing of strength and longevity. For emperors, this made the dish even more valuable. A ruler who consumed shark fin was displaying not just power, but divine endurance. But the logistics of acquiring shark fins made the dish even more exclusive. Fishing fleets had to brave distant seas, haul in massive creatures, and carefully preserve the fins for transport back to China. Every spoonful carried with it the labor of entire expeditions. To present shark fin soup at the imperial table was to proclaim mastery over distant waters and control over the men who sailed them. For ordinary people, shark fin soup was a myth, a story passed down through whispers about the court's excess. It was not meant for the masses, but for emperors, high officials, and honored guests. To be offered shark fin was to be elevated, if only briefly, into the orbit of imperial privilege. So while bird's nest soup symbolized heaven's blessings and silkworm pupae symbolized transformation, shark fin soup symbolized raw dominance. It was a delicacy that said, "The seas belong to us, and we can serve their greatest predators in a porcelain bowl." If you thought bird spit and shark fins were extravagant, wait until you see what the emperor's chefs were carving up next. Ancient Chinese banquets didn't shy away from exotic meats. If it roamed the land, swam the river, or flew the skies, chances are someone at court tried to turn it into a delicacy. But some dishes stood above the rest as the ultimate symbols of luxury: camel humps, bear paws, and leopard fetus stew. These weren't just meals, they were edible trophies of conquest and dominance. Take the camel hump, for example. To most people, a camel was a beast of burden trudging along the Silk Road. But to the emperor, its fatty hump was the prized cut. Roasted until tender, it was served at banquets as proof that the empire's reach extended deep into the deserts of Central Asia. Eating camel hump wasn't just about taste, it was about geography. If the emperor could eat the desert's strongest animal, he symbolically ruled the desert itself. Then there were bear paws. To acquire one meant slaying a powerful predator, a creature respected and feared in equal measure. Braised bear paw was considered an aphrodisiac, a restorative, and a dish fit only for rulers and heroes. Preparing it required days of careful cleaning and simmering to soften the tough flesh. To serve it was to proclaim, "Our empire is so mighty, even the fiercest beasts end up on our plates." Of course, not all exotic meats were about raw power. Some were seen as balancing agents within the yin-yang system. Leopard fetus stew, as shocking as it sounds, was believed to invigorate the body with yang energy. Deer antler broth, too, made regular appearances at court, thought to strengthen bones and replenish vitality. These ingredients, though rare and often gruesome, fed into the idea that consuming strength meant inheriting it. Naturally, none of this was accessible to the average farmer. Ordinary people stuck to pork, chicken, or fish when they were lucky. The exotic meats of the imperial court existed in rumour, fueling both awe and disgust among common folk. But that was the point. These dishes reinforced the emperor's separation from the masses. He ate the impossible because he ruled the impossible. So, when a platter of camel hump or a steaming bear paw arrived at the emperor's table, it wasn't simply dinner. It was theatre, conquest, and cosmic legitimacy, all served on a silver dish. No imperial banquet in ancient China was complete without something to wash it all down. And while delicacies like birds' nests and bear paws impressed the palate, the true artistry often came in the cup. Tea and wine were not just beverages. They were philosophy, medicine, and diplomacy poured into porcelain and bronze. To sip with the emperor was to participate in a ritual as significant as the food itself. Tea began humbly, as a bitter medicinal brew made from fresh leaves. By the Tang dynasty, it had blossomed into a refined cultural practice. The emperor's tea was no ordinary leaf steeped in hot water. It was powdered, whisked, and presented with ceremony. The quality of water was debated endlessly. Spring water from hidden mountain streams was considered the purest, worthy of offering to heaven and emperor alike. Tea symbolized clarity, restraint, and the Confucian virtues of balance. A sip wasn't about quenching thirst. It was about cultivating the mind and aligning the spirit. Wine, by contrast, was for indulgence. Ancient Chinese wine was typically made from millet, rice, or sorghum, often sweet and strong. At court, drinking games and poetry contests accompanied flowing cups of warm wine. Scholars recited verses, generals boasted of victories, and the emperor presided over the intoxicated harmony of his officials. But wine wasn't just merriment, it was ritual. Before sacrifices to ancestors or to heaven, cups were poured as libations, symbolizing respect and continuity between the living and the divine. Drinking had rules, of course. Toasting the emperor required bowing deeply, raising the cup with both hands, and draining it in one go to show loyalty. At large banquets, elaborate sequences of toasts structured the evening, reinforcing hierarchy with every swallow. Refusing a drink could be dangerous. It risked signaling disobedience or disrespect. Many a courtier likely staggered home from these feasts, less from joy than from obligation. Tea and wine also played roles in medicine. Tea was praised for cleansing the body, aiding digestion, and calming the nerves, while wine was believed to invigorate blood flow and ward off cold. Together, they embodied the yin-yang principle. Tea's cooling nature balanced by wine's warming fire. To the emperors of China, a banquet was never just dinner. It was theatre, staged with the precision of an opera. Every dish, every sip of wine, every carefully choreographed movement of servants sent a message. The emperor's power was absolute, his generosity boundless, and his control unquestioned. Guests didn't just eat. They performed their loyalty under the watchful eyes of the Son of Heaven. Banquets often coincided with key political moments. The reception of foreign envoys, the celebration of military victories, or the installation of a crown prince. These feasts could last for days, with musicians playing, dancers performing, and courses arriving in endless waves. Hundreds of dishes might be served, not so that anyone could eat them all, but to overwhelm the senses and remind attendees of the empire's unmatched abundance. The extravagance itself was a declaration of strength. If the emperor could feed an entire hall with delicacies from every corner of China, then surely he could govern it too. For officials, the banquet was both opportunity and danger. To be invited meant favour, but how one behaved at the table could shape careers. Toasting etiquette, conversation topics, even the way a chopstick was held, all were scrutinised. Speak too much, and you risked seeming arrogant. Speak too little, and you risked seeming ungrateful. The safest course was to flatter the emperor while eating daintily, praying that no sudden political trap lay hidden in a bowl of soup. Banquets also doubled as foreign policy. Envoys from Korea, Japan, Vietnam, or Central Asia were dazzled with spreads of shark fin, abalone, and bird's nest soup. These weren't just meals. They were bribes wrapped in silk, edible evidence of the Middle Kingdom's wealth. To dine with the emperor was to be reminded that you were in the orbit of a power too vast to challenge. Many treaties were sealed not in council chambers, but between courses of delicacies impossible to replicate at home. Even the architecture reinforced the message. The banquet halls of the Forbidden City were cavernous, lined with golden dragons, their very design a reminder of heaven's mandate. Guests sat according to rank, each placement a silent declaration of status. Though emperors and dynasties have long since faded, the memory of their extravagant dining habits still lingers in Chinese culture today. Bird's nest soup, shark fin, and exotic meats may no longer fill imperial banquets in the Forbidden City, but their legacy survives as symbols of wealth, refinement, and centuries-old tradition. Even in modern times, these dishes remain tied to celebration and status, appearing at weddings, state dinners, or as rare indulgences for those who can afford them. Yet their influence stretches far beyond luxury. The ancient philosophy of food as medicine, rooted in yin and yang, still shapes the way many Chinese people eat. Herbal broths, carefully balanced meals, and seasonal eating practices trace their lineage directly back to the imperial kitchens. A bowl of chicken soup today might not contain a shark fin or a silkworm pupa, but it still carries echoes of the same belief. Food is not just nourishment, it is healing. The political theatre of food also left its mark. Modern diplomacy often takes place over banquets, with Chinese leaders hosting foreign dignitaries at elaborate meals that subtly echo the traditions of their ancestors. The dishes may have changed, sautéed prawns replacing bear paw, Peking duck standing in for camel hump, but the symbolism remains. To feed generously is to demonstrate power, stability, and respect. At the same time, these delicacies remind us of the gap between emperor and commoner. For most of China's history, ordinary people never tasted such rarities. They survived on rice, millet, vegetables, and the occasional bit of pork. The exotic foods of the court were less about culinary pleasure and more about reinforcing hierarchy. The emperor ate like a god, so that everyone else remembered he was closer to heaven. Today, some of these ancient delicacies are disappearing. Conservation laws and shifting ethics have placed shark fin and exotic meats under scrutiny. Modern tastes are also changing, with more emphasis on accessibility and sustainability. And yet, the fascination remains. To eat what emperors once ate is to take part in history, to taste a fragment of a world where every meal was medicine, ritual, and performance. The legacy of ancient Chinese delicacies is therefore not just about flavour. It is about identity, memory, and the stories a culture tells through its food. Long after the last imperial banquet ended, the echoes still linger in every bowl of soup, every ceremonial toast, every carefully balanced dish. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, wasn't content with just unifying his empire. He wanted to unify eternity itself. By 221 BCE, he had forged warring states into one nation, standardized coins, weights, measures, even axle widths of carts, so they could run on the same roads. He centralized power in a way no ruler before him had managed, but for all his earthly triumphs, one enemy still taunted him: death. The emperor's obsession with immortality was legendary. Court alchemists promised him potions that could grant eternal life, many brewed with mercury and strange minerals. Ironically, the very elixirs meant to prolong his existence were likely poisoning him slowly. But Qin Shi Huang didn't rely solely on alchemists. He also turned his ambition toward architecture, envisioning a tomb that would make him immortal in another way, through sheer scale and spectacle. This wasn't going to be an ordinary burial mound. Qin ordered the construction of a subterranean empire, a mirror of the world he ruled above ground. It would have palaces, offices, stables, entertainers, and an army, an entire civilization meant to accompany him into the afterlife. Historical records suggest that over 700,000 labourers were conscripted, working for decades to complete the project. Many never left, entombed by secrecy and the emperor's paranoia that his resting place remained hidden from looters. At the heart of this underground domain lay the most astonishing creation of all, the Terracotta army. Life-sized clay soldiers, each one unique, each crafted with individual facial features, hairstyles, and expressions. They stood in perfect ranks, ready to guard their emperor for eternity. These soldiers weren't symbolic sketches. They were detailed, fully armed warriors, complete with bronze swords, spears and crossbows, once gleaming with sharp edges and still deadly millennia later. The scale of the project reflected Qin Shi Huang's vision of immortality not just as eternal life, but eternal dominance. He might not escape death, but he could build an empire underground that rivaled his conquests above. It was power carved into clay, immortality baked into terracotta. Thus began one of the greatest archaeological mysteries in history, a tomb sealed, guarded, and rumoured to be surrounded by rivers of flowing mercury, untouched for over 2,000 years. For more than 2,000 years, the Terracotta army remained hidden beneath the soil of Shanxi province, silent and forgotten. The tomb of Qin Shi Huang was described in ancient chronicles, but to most people it sounded like legend, a buried palace guarded by statues and flooded with mercury rivers. Farmers in the 20th century had no reason to believe such tales. Until 1974. That spring, a group of peasants near the village of Lintong were digging a well during a drought. Instead of hitting water, their shovels struck hard clay. At first, it seemed like ordinary debris until a human face emerged from the dirt. But it wasn't flesh or bone, it was terracotta. Soon more fragments appeared: torsos, arms, weapons. What they had stumbled upon was no mere artifact. It was the tip of an army that had slept underground since the time of Alexander the Great. News spread quickly, and archaeologists rushed to the site. As they began excavating, they realized the scale of what had been uncovered was staggering. Pit after pit revealed row upon row of clay warriors, each one unique, standing in formation, as though waiting for a command that would never come. There weren't a dozen, or even 100. There were thousands. The discovery stunned the world. This was not just an archaeological find. It was a time capsule of Qin Shi Huang's ambition. Farmers who had once prayed for water had uncovered a treasure that would forever alter our understanding of ancient China. The site became one of the greatest archaeological digs of the 20th century, comparable to Tutankhamun's tomb in Egypt. For the villagers, the discovery was a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it brought global recognition and tourism, transforming Lintong into a site visited by millions. On the other, their farmland was swallowed by excavation, their lives uprooted by history. Still, the sheer wonder of the Terracotta army outweighed the disruption. China had found not just a relic, but a national symbol, proof of the grandeur and power of its very first emperor. And yet, what was unearthed was only a fraction. The army was vast, but the emperor's actual tomb, said to contain unimaginable treasures and deadly traps, remained sealed. The the discovery was both revelation and reminder. The greatest secret still lay buried beneath the mound. When archaeologists finally brushed away the earth, they were met with an army frozen in eternal formation. Stretching across massive pits, thousands of life-sized terracotta soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, arranged with the discipline of a real Qin dynasty battalion. What struck observers first was the scale, but what amazed them most was the individuality. No two faces were alike. Each warrior bore unique features. A stern jawline here, a crooked nose there, even faint smiles or grimaces. The artisans had crafted not a generic army, but a legion of individuals. Their uniforms and hairstyles marked their rank. Generals stood taller, with elaborate armor and commanding expressions. Archers crouched in firing stance, while cavalrymen held reins for once real horses. Infantry soldiers wore plain tunics, sturdy and practical. The diversity of poses and appearances suggested that the artisans had studied real soldiers as models. This wasn't symbolic art. It was military realism, frozen in clay. The level of craftsmanship extended to the weapons. Many warriors once carried bronze swords, halberds, and crossbows, sharpened to lethal edges. Some blades, coated with chromium oxide, remained astonishingly rust-free even after 2,000 years, hinting at metallurgical techniques far ahead of their time. The soldiers weren't merely decorative, they were battle-ready, as though Qin Shi Huang expected a genuine war in the afterlife. Equally impressive were the horses. Sleek and muscular, these clay steeds were hitched to wooden chariots, their nostrils flared, their stances dynamic, as though they could bolt forward at any moment. Like their human counterparts, they were unique, sculpted with veins, bridles, and carefully carved manes. The army wasn't just an afterlife security detail, it was a complete fighting force. What makes the Terracotta army remarkable is not only its scale, but its humanity. Each soldier seems to possess a story, a life. Standing in front of them, you're not looking at a mass of statues. You're staring into an army of individuals, each ready to defend their emperor even in death. It blurs the line between art and reality, between history and eternity. Qin Shi Huang had demanded immortality, and in a way he achieved it. His soldiers still stand guard, their silent eyes watching across millennia. Proof that an emperor's dream of eternal power could be sculpted into clay. Behind every terracotta soldier stands an invisible army of workers, craftsmen, laborers, and artisans whose skill and suffering gave shape to Qin Shi Huang's vision. Historical records suggest as many as 700,000 people were conscripted to build the mausoleum complex, a number so vast it rivaled the population of entire cities. These were not volunteers, they were prisoners of war, convicted criminals, and common labourers pressed into decades of back-breaking service. The artisan's work demanded extraordinary precision. Each soldier began as hollow clay sections, legs, torso, arms, head, moulded separately and then assembled like a giant puzzle. Once the figure took shape, artists carved details by hand, wrinkles, moustaches, braids, scars. The individuality of each face suggests that real soldiers may have served as models, their likenesses immortalized in clay. This was not art for art's sake. It was propaganda, meant to proclaim the diversity and strength of Qin's empire. After shaping, the statues were fired in kilns to harden the clay, a process that made them life-sized but fragile. Then came the colour. Yes, the terracotta army was once brightly painted. Reds, blues, purples and greens brought the figures to life. Time and exposure to air caused most of the pigments to flake away, leaving the soldiers in the muted earthen tones we see today. In their prime, though, they would have looked startlingly real, as if actual soldiers stood underground waiting for orders. Yet behind the brilliance was cruelty. Workers laboured in secrecy, bound by the emperor's obsession with immortality. Ancient historians claim that once the tomb was sealed, many of the artisans were killed or trapped inside to ensure its mysteries remained hidden. Whether myth or fact, the notion fits Qin Shi Huang's iron rule, a man who demanded absolute loyalty, even in death. The army, therefore, is both a triumph of craftsmanship and a monument to human cost. Every unique face tells two stories, one of artistic mastery and another of the countless nameless artisans who would never see the world above again. They gave the emperor his eternal guards, but paid with their own mortality. Without them, the Terracotta army would never have existed. Their hands shaped clay into eternity, leaving behind not just soldiers, but the echo of their own labour, preserved beneath the soil for over 2,000 years. The Terracotta army wasn't just a clay spectacle, it was armed to the teeth. When archaeologists uncovered the pits, they found thousands of real bronze weapons alongside the soldiers: swords, halberds, spears, and crossbow bolts. Many were still sharp, their edges gleaming after 2 millennia underground. These weren't ceremonial trinkets, they were practical, deadly tools of war. What shocked experts most was the preservation. Some blades showed an unusual shine, leading to speculation that ancient craftsmen had discovered a method of chrome plating, centuries before modern metallurgy. Later studies suggested the effect came from careful polishing and the soil's unique chemistry. But the fact remains. The weapons endured remarkably well, a testament to Qin dynasty technology. The crossbows were particularly advanced. Each came with trigger mechanisms made of bronze, precision engineered, so that even after 2,000 years, they could still fire when tested. The bolts were mass-produced in standardized sizes, evidence of the Empire's drive toward uniformity. It meant that an archer could pick up any quarrel and it would fit his crossbow, a level of logistical efficiency rarely seen in the ancient world. Armor also played a role, though fewer examples survived. Fragments suggest leather and bronze lamella armor once dressed the clay soldiers, now lost to decay. Still, the detailed carvings on the statues show a clear hierarchy. Generals clad in ornate gear, infantry in simpler protection, archers with lighter tunics for mobility. The artisans didn't just sculpt warriors, they sculpted an entire military structure, accurate down to its smallest detail. Even the arrangement of the weapons reflected battlefield strategy. Archers were positioned at the front and flanks, ready to rain down fire. Infantry stood in tight formations, while cavalry and chariots anchored the wings. This wasn't random decoration. It was Qin Shi Huang's military doctrine carved in clay. The same formations that had crushed rival states were recreated underground, ensuring victory in the afterlife. To stand in those pits today is to glimpse not just art, but engineering genius. The weapons and armor bridge the gap between archaeology and military history, showing how Qin's armies dominated the battlefield. In death, as in life, Qin Shi Huang would be defended by the most advanced technology of his age. As impressive as the Terracotta army is, it's only the prelude. The soldiers guard a vast burial mound that has never been opened, the actual tomb of Qin Shi Huang. According to ancient sources, the mausoleum was a subterranean palace meant to replicate the empire he ruled in life. It supposedly contained rivers and seas made of liquid mercury, powered by ingenious mechanical systems that mimicked the natural world. Stars were painted on the ceiling to mirror the night sky, and pearls were used to simulate the glow of the moon. The historian Sima Qian, writing a century after Qin's death, described a tomb filled with treasures, crossbow traps, and booby traps designed to kill intruders. The emperor, paranoid even in death, wanted his resting place to remain untouched forever. Modern science lends eerie support to these stories. Soil samples around the mound reveal unusually high concentrations of mercury, suggesting that the toxic rivers described by Sima Qian may actually exist. So why hasn't the tomb been opened? For one, the Chinese government has adopted a policy of caution. Archaeologists fear that opening the chamber could destroy priceless artifacts. The painted terracotta soldiers lost their vibrant colours within minutes of exposure to air. Imagine what would happen to 2,000-year-old wood, silk, or paper. Technology simply isn't advanced enough yet to excavate the tomb without irreparable damage. There are also ethical and political concerns. Qin Shi Huang is both a unifier and a tyrant in Chinese history, a man remembered for both his achievements and his brutal rule. Disturbing his tomb might spark debates over how his legacy should be handled. For now, the mound stands as a sealed time capsule, one of the last great unopened tombs in the world. The mystery only deepens the fascination. Beneath that hill may lie treasures beyond imagination, or a lethal chamber of poison gas and collapsed tunnels. Until the day comes when technology can safely pierce its secrets, Qin Shi Huang will continue to rest in silence, guarded by an army of clay that has already stunned the world. His true mausoleum remains the ultimate archaeological cliffhanger, visible, yet forever out of reach. The Terracotta army was more than a security detail for the afterlife. It was propaganda, baked into clay. Qin Shi Huang understood the power of spectacle. In life, he built massive roads, walls, and palaces to show the people that his rule was absolute. In death, he commanded a clay army to broadcast the same message, that even the grave could not strip him of power. Each soldier in the pits wasn't just a guardian, it was a symbol of unity. The first emperor had welded 7 warring states into one empire. The diversity of the warriors, different facial features, hairstyles, and armor styles mirrored the diversity of the people now under his control. Farmers, hunters, and warriors from across China were all represented, transformed into silent servants for eternity. The message was clear. Qin's reach extended across all regions, and his rule would last forever. The army also projected fear. Imagine being a commoner in ancient China and hearing whispers that your emperor had an entire underground army, complete with weapons, horses, and chariots, waiting to defend him after death. It reinforced the idea that Qin Shi Huang was more than a man. He was a figure chosen by heaven, whose authority transcended mortality. To oppose him was to oppose not only a living emperor, but one who could command legions from beyond the grave. Even the act of building the army was political theatre. Conscripting hundreds of thousands of labourers reminded everyone that the emperor's will could mobilize unimaginable manpower. The artisans who sculpted unique faces may have thought they were creating individuals, but collectively, those soldiers became a monolith of obedience, a metaphor for the Qin state itself. Diverse people molded into a single, unstoppable machine. 2,000 years later, the army still fulfills its propaganda role. Tourists from around the world stand in awe, just as subjects once did before Qin's massive building projects. The emperor's message has endured. He was powerful, he was eternal, and he left behind monuments that no one could ignore. The Terracotta army wasn't just about defending a tomb, it was about defending a legacy. And in that mission, it has succeeded brilliantly. When farmers unearthed the Terracotta army in 1974, they didn't just expose an archaeological wonder, they uncovered a cultural treasure that reshaped modern China's identity. What had been a dusty legend in ancient chronicles suddenly stood in the light, row upon row of clay soldiers staring back after 2,000 years. The discovery stunned the world, but its greatest impact was felt at home. For the Chinese government, the Terracotta army became a symbol of national pride. It showcased China's ingenuity, craftsmanship, and historical continuity. At a time when the country was emerging from the upheavals of the Cultural Revolution, the find offered something powerful. Proof that China's ancient civilization had created wonders on par with the pyramids of Egypt. The soldiers became silent ambassadors, reminding both citizens and foreigners that Chinese history was as grand and enduring as any in the world. Tourism exploded. Lintong, once a sleepy farming village, transformed into a global destination. Millions of visitors now walk through the pits each year, gazing at the soldiers who once guarded Qin Shi Huang. The economic impact has been immense. Hotels, museums, and entire industries sprouted around the site. For the farmers who found the first fragments, the discovery brought both disruption and fame. Some were hired to autograph guidebooks, others lamented the loss of their farmland. History had literally changed the ground beneath their feet. Internationally, the Terracotta Army became a cultural icon. Exhibitions travelled to major museums across the globe, drawing record-breaking crowds. The soldiers, with their hauntingly human faces, became China's most recognisable archaeological export. They carried not just the story of Qin Shi Huang, but the narrative of a nation reclaiming its ancient past and using it to inspire the present. But the discovery also raised questions. How should modern China view Qin Shi Huang, a unifier who laid the foundation of the nation, or a tyrant who ruled with cruelty and fear? The Terracotta Army allowed the government to emphasize the former, promoting unity and pride, while leaving the darker aspects of his reign in the shadows. In the end, the rediscovery didn't just preserve history, it redefined it. The soldiers stood not only as guardians of an emperor's tomb, but as symbols of a civilization reclaiming its legacy. More than 2,000 years after they were entombed, the Terracotta Army still marches on, not across battlefields, but through the imagination of the world. Their silent ranks have become one of the greatest archaeological icons of human history, standing alongside the pyramids of Giza and the ruins of Machu Picchu as symbols of civilizations that dreamed on a monumental scale. For historians, the army is a window into the past. It reveals the military organization of the Qin dynasty, the artistry of its craftsmen, and the sheer ambition of a ruler determined to conquer even death. Every soldier's face, every weapon, every trace of pigment is a fragment of history waiting to be pieced together. The site remains an open book that scholars are still learning to read, each excavation deepening our understanding of how China's first empire functioned. For modern China, the Terracotta Army is more than history. It is heritage. The soldiers are cultural ambassadors, drawing millions of tourists, inspiring artists, and even shaping popular media. They stand as proof that Chinese civilization was not only ancient, but advanced, capable of achievements that continue to awe the modern world. School children learn of them as part of their national story, while international visitors see them as evidence of a culture whose influence has never ceased. Yet the legacy of the Terracotta Army is also wrapped in mystery. The unopened tomb of Qin Shi Huang still looms nearby, sealed beneath its mound, its secrets guarded by Mercury and myth. Until technology allows for safe excavation, the Emperor's grandest secrets remain untold. That tension between what we know and what lies hidden fuels endless fascination. The army is both a revelation and a teaser, a promise that the greatest discovery may still await. Perhaps that is the true genius of Qin Shi Huang's vision. He may not have found literal immortality, but his soldiers ensure that his name, his power, and his ambition endure. They remind us that empires may fall, but stories and monuments live on. The Terracotta Army is more than clay and soil. It is a dialogue across millennia, where silent soldiers continue to tell us about power, fear, artistry, and the eternal human struggle against time itself. The Illyrians were born of stone and sea. Their homeland stretched along the jagged eastern coast of the Adriatic, where mountains plunged directly into salt water and fertile valleys were rare. It was a harsh environment, demanding resilience. Fields of grain were limited, and herding goats or sheep could only provide so much. To survive, Illyrians turned to the one resource that was limitless and ever-present: the sea. From an early age, children were raised with the sound of waves as their lullaby and the smell of salt in their lungs. Fishing was a daily necessity, but the Illyrians quickly learned that the Adriatic was not just a pantry, it was a highway. Its inlets, islands, and hidden coves provided both shelter and opportunity. Those who mastered its rhythms could thrive. Those who did not were doomed to hunger. This geography shaped more than diet. It shaped identity. Villages clung to rocky cliffs, their homes overlooking narrow harbours where boats were pulled up onto the beach. Men and women alike were skilled in navigating treacherous waters, mending sails and rowing against unpredictable currents. The Adriatic was both a provider and a battlefield, and it demanded respect. To live on its shores was to live on a knife's edge. The Illyrians became seafarers not by choice but by necessity. trade and raiding blurred together, for in a land with little farmland, acquiring resources from passing ships seemed less like crime and more like survival. A merchant vessel heavy with wine, olive oil, or grain was a floating solution to winter's scarcity. For the Illyrians, the sea was freedom, wealth, and power rolled into one. Over time, this reliance on the sea hardened into culture. Songs told of heroic raids. Legends celebrated captains who returned with riches. To be skilled at seafaring was not merely practical. It was a mark of status. Chiefs who commanded fleets could secure loyalty more effectively than those who controlled land. The Adriatic, with its endless horizon, became the Illyrian stage for glory. Thus, long before Rome or Greece considered Illyrians pirates, the Illyrians themselves knew only that they were people of the coast, shaped by waves, sharpened by hunger, and destined to build their lives not on the land, but on the restless surface of the sea. To dominate the Adriatic, the Illyrians needed more than courage. They needed the perfect ship. What emerged from their rocky harbours was the lembus, plural lembi, a vessel that became the beating heart of Illyrian seafaring and piracy. Unlike the heavy merchant ships that lumbered along trade routes, the lembus was built for speed, agility, and stealth. Long and narrow, with a shallow draft, it could slip into the smallest inlets or skim across shoals where larger ships would run aground. Its lightweight frame made it quick to launch from beaches, allowing entire raiding parties to melt into the sea before an enemy even realized what was happening. The lembus was propelled primarily by oars, which meant it wasn't held hostage by the wind. This gave the Illyrians a deadly advantage over sailing ships, which could be trapped in unfavorable conditions. A squadron of lembi, each packed with armed warriors, could descend upon a target from multiple angles, overwhelming larger but slower vessels. To a Roman or Greek merchant captain, spotting the silhouettes of lembi on the horizon was a nightmare, a sign that escape was impossible. But the lembus was more than a war machine. It reflected Illyrian ingenuity and their intimate knowledge of the Adriatic. Built from local timber, easy to repair, and light enough to be hauled across land if needed, these ships were perfectly adapted to their environment. Coastal villages worked together to construct them, and entire communities depended on their success. A well-built lembus could feed families, defend a harbour, or enrich a chieftain with spoils of war. The reputation of the lembus spread quickly. Ancient writers like Polybius and Appian described these vessels with a mixture of admiration and dread, acknowledging their role in turning the Adriatic into what Romans bitterly called a pirate sea. Even foreign powers recognized their utility. Macedonian kings at times employed Illyrian fleets, hiring them as mercenaries to harass enemies or disrupt rival trade routes. For the Illyrians themselves, the lembus was more than wood and oars. It was identity in motion. To climb aboard was to embrace the sea as ally and weapon, to transform hunger into opportunity. The ship was a symbol of freedom, power, and survival, and with every raid it carried, the legend of Illyrian seamanship grew stronger. The lembus was not just a vessel. It was the sharp edge of Illyrian culture, slicing its mark into Mediterranean history. For the Illyrians, piracy was not simply reckless plundering, it was a way of life shaped by necessity. Along the rugged Adriatic coast, farmland was scarce and unpredictable. Harvests could not reliably feed the population, and trade was limited by geography. To survive, Illyrian communities turned to the sea, and piracy became less a crime than an economic strategy. Raiding merchant vessels was often more profitable than waiting on poor soil. A single captured ship might yield grain, wine, oil, cloth, or even slaves, enough to sustain an entire tribe through lean months. To the Illyrians, these acts were not theft, but redistribution, taking from outsiders what their homeland could not provide. Piracy blurred into trade, for goods taken at sea were sold, bartered, or integrated directly into village life. It was also a path to prestige. Leaders who commanded successful raids won respect, loyalty, and authority. A chief who could provide wealth from the sea earned followers far more quickly than one who merely tended goats on a hillside. piracy created opportunities for ambitious warriors, who could rise in status by bringing home spoils and captives. In this way, maritime raiding was as much politics as economics. The practice also became woven into culture. Illyrian songs and stories celebrated cunning seafarers who struck suddenly and vanished before retaliation could come. Raids were often timed with seasonal rhythms, when trade routes were busiest and when the sea's conditions gave Lemby an advantage. For many Illyrian tribes, piracy wasn't a shameful secret. It was a proud tradition, passed from one generation to the next. Of course, not everyone viewed it that way. To Greek and Roman merchants, Illyrians were ruthless predators who turned the Adriatic into a gauntlet of terror. Letters and chronicles described them as raiders without mercy, uninterested in treaties or trade agreements. But this was largely the perspective of outsiders whose wealth was threatened. From the Illyrian point of view, piracy was survival with honor attached. In short, piracy was never just opportunistic violence, it was adaptation to environment, a social ladder for the ambitious, and a cultural identity for a people whose lives were bound to the sea. To be Illyrian was to accept that the Adriatic was both provider and battlefield, and piracy was the art of surviving its tides. If the Illyrians had one true advantage at sea, it was the element of surprise. Their survival depended on striking hard and fast before their enemies could react. To merchants and rival powers, they seemed to appear out of nowhere, ghosts of the Adriatic who struck without warning and vanished just as quickly. Their secret weapon was the lembus, small and swift enough to outmaneuver bulky trade ships. Unlike vessels that relied on sails, the Illyrians rowed, which meant they were not bound by the wind. This gave them freedom to attack in calm weather, or even when the breeze worked against their prey. With shallow drafts, their ships could dart into hidden coves and rocky inlets, disappearing from sight where no larger vessel dared to follow. Illyrian raiders were masters of timing. They often attacked at dawn, when crews were still groggy and ships least prepared. Others struck during storms, when visibility was poor and defences low. A squadron of Lemby could swarm a target from multiple sides, overwhelming defenders before they could even raise alarm. By the time word reached authorities, the Illyrians were already gone, their ships vanishing into the labyrinth of islands that dotted the eastern Adriatic. What made these tactics especially effective was the psychology of fear. Merchants began to dread certain stretches of coast, whispering of Illyrian ambushes. Even the mere sight of narrow, fast-moving vessels on the horizon was enough to send panic through a convoy. Sometimes Illyrians didn't even need to fight. Ships surrendered to avoid bloodshed, knowing resistance was useless against such swift predators. The raids weren't always random either. Illyrian chieftains understood trade routes intimately, knowing when shipments of grain, wine, or precious metals were due. They turned the Adriatic into a hunting ground, choosing moments when their prey was richest and most vulnerable. To them, piracy was as much strategy as it was force. For outsiders, this unpredictability made the Illyrians seem unstoppable. Greek and Roman writers described them as relentless raiders who controlled the sea by terror alone. But to the Illyrians, surprise was not cruelty. It was necessity. With fewer ships and fewer resources, cunning was their greatest weapon. And so, long before Rome's legions arrived to challenge them, the Illyrians carved their dominance through ambush, stealth, and speed. They ruled the Adriatic not by sheer numbers, but by making every strike count. In most of the ancient Mediterranean, the sea was considered a man's arena. But among the Illyrians, women did not simply watch from the shore, they sometimes commanded from the deck. The most famous example was Queen Tota, who in the 3rd century BCE became the face of Illyrian power and piracy. Feared from the Adriatic to the Roman Senate itself, Tota rose to prominence after the death of her husband, King Agron. Instead of stepping aside for a male regent, she seized control of the kingdom and its fleets. Roman historians, often hostile to powerful women, described her as bold and uncompromising. She continued Illyria's maritime tradition with ferocity, ordering her captains to raid without restraint. Under her command, Illyrian piracy reached a scale that rattled the richest states of the Mediterranean. Her leadership was more than symbolic. Ancient sources describe her as directly involved in naval strategy, using the lembi to harass and overwhelm merchant convoys. She extended her influence along the coasts of Epirus and Greece, and her fleets extracted tribute from those unable to resist. For the Illyrians, having a queen at the helm was not strange. It was proof that seafaring was woven so deeply into their society that even women could rise to power through it. Of course, Roman writers painted Tutor as reckless, even villainous. They accused her of dismissing Roman envoys with arrogance, allegedly declaring that piracy was a tradition of her people and she would not forbid her subjects from practicing it. Whether these words were exaggerated or not, they captured a cultural truth. To the Illyrians, raiding was not shameful but honourable, a way to secure survival and glory. Tutor embodied that ethos, unashamed and unyielding. Her reign, however, also highlighted the dangers of Illyrian piracy colliding with rising Roman power. What Rome might have ignored from petty raiders, it could not tolerate from a queen who commanded fleets and openly defied their authority. In time, her leadership would provoke the First Illyrian War, but Tutor's legacy endured. She became a rare example of a woman in antiquity who ruled at sea, her name remembered in both fear and admiration. In Illyrian culture, her power was not an anomaly. It was the natural extension of a society where the sea itself leveled hierarchies and demanded strength, no matter who held the oars. By the late 3rd century BCE, the Adriatic was no longer just an Illyrian playground. It was Rome's lifeline. As the Republic expanded, its merchants increasingly relied on sea routes to bring grain, wine, and goods from Greece and beyond. But those waters were dominated by Illyrian fleets, and every successful raid was not only a loss of cargo, but also a slap to Roman prestige. At first, Rome tolerated the nuisance. After all, piracy was common across the Mediterranean, and Illyrian raiders were just one of many dangers. But Queen Tutor's aggressive policies escalated the situation. Under her command, Illyrian piracy no longer looked like scattered raids. It looked like state-sponsored naval warfare. Merchant ships travelling between Italy and Greece reported constant harassment, with some even forced to pay tribute to continue sailing. To Rome, this was intolerable. The breaking point came when Roman envoys were sent to negotiate with Tutor. According to Roman sources, she dismissed their demands, insisting that Illyrian subjects were free to raid as they pleased. Worse, one of the envoys was murdered on his return journey, a provocation Rome could not ignore. Whether this incident happened exactly as the Romans described is debatable, but in Roman politics, perception mattered more than truth. The Senate now had justification for war. Frustration turned to fury. Roman senators argued that Illyrian piracy threatened not only commerce, but also Rome's reputation as the emerging Mediterranean power. If they allowed Illyrians to bully their merchants, how could they claim to protect their allies in Greece? Intervention was no longer about lost grain shipments. It was about honour, dominance, and setting an example. Meanwhile, Illyrians underestimated the scale of Roman ambition. To them, piracy was a tradition, a way of life that had sustained their people for generations. They did not see themselves as criminals, but as masters of their sea. Tutor likely believed that Rome, preoccupied with its struggles in Italy and beyond, would tolerate Illyrian raids as others had. She was wrong. By 229 BCE, Rome had resolved to act. What began as frustration over piracy transformed into the Republic's first major overseas campaign. The Illyrians, who had ruled the Adriatic by speed and stealth, were about to face a power that could match them with sheer discipline and scale. The age of unchecked piracy was coming to a dramatic turning point. In 229 BCE, Rome finally crossed the Adriatic with a fleet and an army, launching what history remembers as the First Illyrian War. For the Republic, this was more than a campaign against piracy. It was its first major naval intervention outside Italy. For the Illyrians, it was the moment their centuries-old dominance of the sea collided with a rising superpower. The Romans moved quickly. their fleet swept into the Adriatic, targeting Illyrian strongholds along the coast. Cities that had once profited from piracy or offered safe harbor to raiders now faced the choice of surrender or destruction. Many coastal communities, sensing Rome's overwhelming power, defected early, eager to escape Queen Tutor's tightening grip and avoid the wrath of the legions. Tutor's lembi were formidable in surprise raids, but they were no match for Rome's disciplined naval formations. Roman ships were larger, sturdier, and backed by soldiers trained for boarding combat. The very tactics that made Illyrians masters of ambush proved useless against an enemy that brought the fight to their doorstep. Where Illyrian speed had once guaranteed victory, Roman persistence and numbers forced retreat. The war was also political. Rome wasn't just battling pirates, it was securing alliances. Greek city-states, long harassed by Illyrian raids, welcomed Roman protection, seeing the Republic as a counterbalance to Illyrian aggression. By presenting themselves as liberators, the Romans turned Illyrian piracy into justification for expanding their influence into the Balkans. Tutor resisted fiercely, but by 228 BCE, her power was broken. Defeated and humiliated, she was forced to sign a treaty. The terms were harsh. She lost control over much of the Adriatic coast, her navy was restricted, and she was barred from sailing south of her capital with more than 2 unarmed ships. Rome had effectively ended Illyria's naval supremacy, clipping the wings of a people whose identity was tied to the sea. The First Illyrian War was a turning point. For the Romans, it proved that they could project power across the waves, setting a precedent for future Mediterranean campaigns. For the Illyrians, it marked the beginning of decline, as their proud tradition of piracy would now face constant Roman pressure. The Adriatic, once Illyrian waters, was slowly becoming a Roman lake. The First Illyrian War may have humbled Queen Tutor, but it did not end Illyrian resistance. Piracy was too deeply ingrained in their way of life to vanish with a treaty. For decades after 228 BCE, Illyrian chiefs and kings continued to test Rome's patience, rebuilding fleets and resuming raids whenever they sensed Roman attention was elsewhere. But each defiance brought harsher Roman retaliation, slowly grinding down Illyrian independence. One of the most determined rulers was Demetrius of Pharos, a former ally of Rome who turned against them once he saw an opportunity to revive Illyrian seafaring power. He reorganized fleets of lembi and extended raids deeper into Greek waters, provoking what became the Second Illyrian War in 219 BCE. This time, Rome responded with overwhelming force, crushing Demetrius's fleets and seizing his strongholds. He fled into exile, and Illyria's remaining autonomy shrank even further. But resistance did not die easily. Later, kings like Gentius tried to rally Illyrian tribes against Rome, raising fleets and armies to reclaim their freedom. By the mid-2nd century BCE, however, the balance of power was hopelessly one-sided. In 168 BCE, during the Third Illyrian War, Rome moved decisively. Gentius was defeated, captured, and paraded in a Roman triumph. His kingdom was dismantled, and Illyria was reorganized into Roman provinces. For the Illyrians, this was the final blow. Their once feared fleets were dismantled, their piracy outlawed, and their independence extinguished. The Adriatic, once dominated by lembi and raiding parties, became a corridor patrolled by Roman galleys. Where Illyrian chiefs once demanded tribute, Roman tax collectors now reigned. Yet even in defeat, the Illyrians left their mark. Roman authors continued to write of them with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. Their skill at sea, their daring raids, and their stubborn resistance became part of Rome's own mythology of conquest, proof of challenges overcome on the road to empire. The conquest of Illyria marked more than the end of piracy in the Adriatic. It was also the beginning of Rome's dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. By breaking Illyrian freedom, Rome secured a naval foothold that would later enable campaigns against Macedonia and Greece. In crushing the pirates, Rome had unlocked the wider world. For the Illyrians, however, the loss of their seafaring independence meant more than political subjugation. It marked the fading of an identity built on the waves. The Adriatic would never again belong to them. Though Rome crushed Illyrian independence and outlawed their piracy, the memory of Illyrian seamanship did not vanish. In fact, their reputation as fearless raiders and cunning sailors echoed for centuries, shaping both how their neighbours remembered them and how their descendants saw themselves. The Adriatic may have become a Roman lake, but its history still carried the imprint of Illyrian oars. The Lembus, once the terror of merchants, influenced ship design long after the Illyrians were gone. Its shallow draft and speed inspired later naval tactics in the Adriatic, where maneuverability mattered more than brute force. Roman writers, though hostile to Illyrian piracy, often acknowledge the effectiveness of these vessels. The very ships Rome had once feared were eventually studied and adapted for Roman use. Culturally, the Illyrians left behind a legacy of resilience. Their reliance on the sea forged a society that valued courage, adaptability, and cunning. To them, piracy had not been shameful. It was a solution to geography, a declaration that survival sometimes demanded bending the rules of empire and commerce. Even under Roman rule, coastal communities in the Balkans retained their maritime traditions, passing down skills in navigation, fishing, and raiding that would resurface in later centuries. In a broader sense, the Illyrian story highlights a recurring theme in history: small seafaring peoples challenging great powers through speed, daring, and knowledge of the sea. Just as the Vikings would raid medieval Europe, the Illyrians once turned the Adriatic into their hunting ground. Their piracy forced larger states to adapt, shaping trade routes, military strategy, and diplomacy. In this way, the Illyrians punched far above their weight in the ancient world. Today, the Illyrian name survives mostly in fragments, place names, archaeological finds, and echoes in Balkan history. Yet their seafaring reputation endures. To study them is to be reminded that history is not only made by empires, but also by the pirates who dared to defy them. The Illyrians may have lost their freedom to Rome, but they left behind a legacy carved into the waves of the Adriatic, a people who turned survival into identity and piracy into a kind of immortality.